everybody, my name is Elisa and this week I will be sewing a red linen day dress with you. We do have a bit of a heat wave in London right now, which I'm really excited about, so I thought I was going to make the perfect dress for the occasion. It is a tea dress, you could also call it a day dress. It does have a bit of a milkmaid vibe to it. It has this like tie feature here in the front for this gathered look. It also has a midi skirt with 2 slits for extra mobility. I also added pockets for extra comfort, so it is definitely the perfect dress for all you adventurers out there. If you don't know what the day brings, then this is probably what you want to wear. First up, I'm going to show you how I drafted the pattern so you can recreate it at home, since I feel like that is something that you guys are interested in, and then we are going to get into the sewing process. So let's do this. Alright, first up, please excuse these. It's always better to go for comfort than style when doing creative work. To start the pattern drafting process, I pulled out my bodice slopers, which I made with a blog post from In the Folds. Having these really speeds up the process of any project, as you can just trace them to ensure that whatever you make will fit you. I will link it below so you can create your own. However, if you do not have something like this, I will tell you which measurements I used. Keep in mind that you will need to alter them to your own measurements to make sure that the dress will fit you. Firstly, you will have to draw a rectangle that measures the length of your neckline to your waist times a quarter of your waist measurement plus 11 centimeters. For reference, my measurements were 26.5 centimeters for the height of the rectangle times 29 centimeters for the width. You then section your rectangle into the panels for the gathering tunnels. For my first section, I measured 10 centimeters down from the top left corner of my rectangle and created a line perpendicular to the center front. This will be the bust panel, so you will have to make sure that this gives you enough room to cover up. For the following 2 sections, I divided the remaining space by 2, effectively creating 2 panels 8 centimeters in height, and again drew a line perpendicular to the center front. Next, I measured 6 centimeters inwards from the top right corner. This will be your armhole. From there, I measured 7.5 centimeters upwards and created a mark. You can now connect the armhole point with the point you just created with the curve of your pattern master, and do the same thing from the point you just created to the center front. You should then achieve this general shape. For the back bodice piece, I measured a quarter of my waist circumference as it is distributed in my back and drew a line. It's important to think about that if you need more space in the front than in the back. Some people will have a smaller back than belly, for others it might be vice versa. As reference, for me that was 17 centimeters. You then draw a line from the outer right end of that line upwards in 90 degrees. On the line, make a mark where you want your back to hit. Some friends will prefer a higher back, some a lower back, so do what you feel good with. For reference, for me that was 25 centimeters. You then measure a quarter of your bust circumference towards the left from that point to mark the armhole point of your back bodice piece. It's not quite in a 90-degree angle, as the side seam should be identical to your front side seam. For me that was 26.5 centimeters. Create a line and connect that point with the side seam point on your waist. You should end up with something looking like this. The skirt will be a lot easier to make. Draw out a rectangle that is the length of your skirt from your belly button to where you want the hemline to hit. For me that was about 75 centimeters, times half of the width of your front skirt. For me that was 50 centimeters. On your waistline, mark half of the width of your front bodice panel. For me that was 29 centimeters. From the center front of the waistline, measure down the distance to your hip. For me that is 23 centimeters. If you're not 5'9" like me, this will likely be a bit shorter. Draw a line perpendicular to the center front and mark a quarter of your hip measurement there. For me, that was 27-ish centimeters. I added 3 centimeters for comfort. You can now connect this point with your width measurement on your hemline, as well as with your waist measurement with the curve of your pattern master. To mark where you want the slit to be, measure inwards from the center front and draw a line parallel to your center front line. I measured inwards about 13 centimeters. Now you have your skirt pattern. Now let's get into the sewing process. I used this heavy-ish linen in this deep red shade. I already used the same kind in white for my Silky Meets Bridgerton dress, and it is really nice to work with. It is enzyme washed, which I'm not quite sure what that means, but it's cool. Here are my pieces as they were cut out. One thing to mention is that I cut my skirt on the bias, so in a 45-degree angle on the fabric to allow for a nicer drape. I wasn't sure if it would make a lot of a difference on this stiff linen, as usually this technique is used a lot with silks and satins, but I feel like it was a nice way to make it a bit more high-end. As a first step in the sewing process, I grabbed the first tier of the front bodice and overlocked the center front raw edges. I then put them right sides together and gave it a straight stitch. I pressed it, top stitched the seam allowance with a distance of about 1.5 centimeters from the center front, and then cut it open to create this V shape. You will need to make sure that you have locked the seam about where you want the opening to end so it doesn't unravel. I then overlocked the neckline and folded it over by about 1.5 centimeters. After pressing it, I top stitched the tunnel closed. I then grabbed the next two tiers of the front bodice. I decided to add some darts to the bust panel before pinning it wrong sides together with the following panel, trying to use more seam allowance for each of the bottom panels than the one above it. After sewing those seams, I cut back the seam allowance of each of the top panels even further. I then folded the seam allowance of the panel below and pressed it like so to create tunnels for elastic to go in. I do not know if this is a proper technique or if it has a name, but it worked very well for this piece. I top stitched the tunnels and this is what it ended up looking like. Next up, I needed to create some spaghetti straps for both holding up the dress and to create a tie feature for the front. For that, I cut out 4 strips of bias tape and sewed them closed with my machine. I cut back the seam allowance and grabbed the needle with some double thread. I attached it to one end of the strap and inserted the needle into the tunnel with the end going in first. I guided it through the entire strap and then started to turn the strap inside out, or outside out to be exact. This was a bit fiddly because the surface of the linen is very texturous and doesn't glide through that easily, but I eventually made it. Good morning, I'm here with my cup of tea. It's like 7:15-ish in the morning. I feel fresh and ready for the day. I am going to continue the work on the red linen dress now. It seems to be a pretty straightforward project, which I'm really excited about. I already assembled the front part of the bodice yesterday, threaded in the ties that are gonna gather the top situation. I'm gonna join it now with the back bodice piece, thread in the elastic, and then I can start with the skirt. And I'm feeling a bit optimistic today. Maybe, just maybe, I can do the final shots tonight, which would be amazing because it's beautiful outside. So let's do this. On the next day, I filled 2 of my 4 spaghetti straps through the tunnels on the neckline and used the safety pin technique to thread some elastic through the remaining tunnels. To assemble the front skirt, I first took the 2 panels and pinned them right sides together where the slits would be. I started with a stitch length of 3 from the waistline down, locking the seam halfway through where I wanted the slit to start. I then changed my machine to a stitch length of 5 and basted down the rest of the seam without closing it. I then pressed the seam allowance for both sides open and overlocked the raw edges. I then used my seam ripper to open up the slit. To give the slits a nice finish and ensure they wouldn't open further, I top stitched the seam allowance like so. To join the front bodice and front skirt, I applied the same technique as I did with the tunnels at the top to create room for another elastic at the waist. To join the back bodice and the skirt, I first sewed in the darts in the skirt. I overlocked all the raw edges of my pieces except for the side seam. I then pinned and sewed bodice and skirt right sides together, seam allowance flush this time. I also folded over the top of the back and stitched it down for a clean look. We are very close to the finish line. I attached the spaghetti straps to the front top and sewed the armholes. I decided last minute that I wanted the skirt to have pockets, so I quickly cut some out and pinned them into the skirt. Back and front of the dress pinned together looked like this. I sewed down the entirety of the side seams and overlocked them. As a last step, I attached the spaghetti straps to the back, making sure they were the right length. And with that, the dress was finished. I really like how this dress turned out. It is really comfortable and practical, and it is the perfect fit for a day when you don't quite know what's going to happen. It works for cycling, for a drink in a bar, for a day in the park, or a shopping stroll in the city. I really feel like a versatile day dress is a wardrobe staple, and this matches the brief. Let me know what you think in the comments. See you soon!